Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Tuesday, October 29th around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking about all of the conference races. We have about a million things to get into because all of these conference races have a ton of logjams up at the top. There have been some thinning out over the last couple of weeks, but not necessarily quite as much as we wanted. And then we'll get into some winners and losers of this past week. A&M boosters have to be feeling pretty good about the investment they made to buy out Jimbo Fisher right about now. And then we'll get into a little bit of a Week 9 whip around all of the games we didn't have a chance to get to before. A lot of Group of 5 games that I want to get you guys updated on, including one of the craziest comebacks you will see in all of college football and football in general, really. And then you'll get into Week 9 superlatives, a ton of different things, biggest win of the week, individual performance of the week, statement of the week, and so many more. And then we'll finish off with a top 15 Tuesday. Definitely going to expand this just a little bit down the stretch of the season because we got some big games coming up, and I want to make sure you guys know who I have on my bubble. There's one team that's missing from my top 15 that might be a little bit surprising to some people. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use that super thanks feature on the bottom of the chat at the super chat feature, at the bottom of the chat on the Sports Network page. You can click on that $sign, add any question, comment you'd like. It'll pop up on the screen and we can have fun back and forth here. Definitely want this to be interactive as we head into the home stretch of the season, as it were. But let's go ahead and jump into this because these conference races are getting a little bit more understandable, a little bit more attainable, a little bit more digestible, but at a certain point, it's continuing to just get absolutely off the walls crazy, and there's still plenty of teams that are very much in the fight, and it includes 6 or 7 teams here, depending on the way that you cut it. There are a lot of different teams on this list that absolutely can make a little bit of a run in this conference this upcoming year. So the SEC in general, A&M's up at top. They're sitting 5-0 in conference play, playing really, really good football right about now. So they're fine. They're doing what they need to be doing, no doubt about that. Then you have a couple other teams. You got Georgia, Texas, Tennessee, LSU, and Alabama. All those teams are very much in it. Ole Miss is in it as well. I want to say that, are they really 5-3? I feel like that record's wrong. Apologies if it is. They could be 6-2. But at the end of the day, those feel like the 7 teams that are actually in the hunt, that have an ability to possibly go on to get to the CFP, to possibly, in some cases win the conference. I feel like that's kind of reserved for those top 4 teams right there because they have a couple of games coming up against each other, and if they take care of business and then whoever wins those games, that will be the team. Those will be the teams in Atlanta at the end of the year. So it's kind of a hard thing to break down because it feels like we have about 7 teams. I think it's 3, maybe 4 spots in the CFP, probably 3, the way everything's starting to shake out. So who could that be? You have the Texas A&M game, likely going to knock one of those out, but let's just say Texas is 10-2 at the end of the year. It wouldn't be the most impressive resume, but let's be totally honest with each other. That Longhorn definitely gives them a little bit of boost in the conversations for the playoff. Alabama runs the table. They're 10-2. That creates another problem. You have to figure out how good their schedule is comparative to other people because a 10-2 A&M, a 10-2 Alabama, 10-2 A&M would have the win over LSU, and Alabama would as well, and you'd have to figure out how you kind of go about that. A&M won it at home, Alabama won it on the road, the margin of victory, it would be a nightmare to figure out. But the reality is, it feels like we're heading for a logjam in this conference. It feels like we're heading for a ton of different tiebreakers to be kind of imposed here one way or the other. Now, we could avoid that altogether. Let's say Tennessee goes down to Athens in a couple of weeks, loses to Georgia, and then Texas goes to A&M in a couple of weeks, loses to A&M. It would be A&M and Georgia, no question about it. If Texas wins out, it would be Texas and Georgia, no doubt about it. If Tennessee beats Georgia, it would then be Texas and Tennessee. So you're pretty much looking at those 4 teams for the conference championship. LSU could get back into the hunt, only being 3-1 in conference, so still have an ability to find their way back into this thing. But as of right now, it feels like those 4 teams at the top are going to be the ones that you're watching down the stretch of the season, at least for the SEC title. For the CFP, I believe there's about 7 teams going all the way down to Ole Miss. I feel like everyone has a shot. Missouri, I've talked about. I think they're out of it. Arkansas, no way. I can't imagine a 3-loss Arkansas is going to ever find their way into this thing, even if they were to beat Ole Miss this upcoming weekend. But at the end of the day, if you want to break it down into real contenders and real pretenders, I think the best way to do it is probably just break it down by this list, if I'm being totally honest. I do think those 4 top teams, and really those 3 top teams, but let's say those 4 top teams for the time being, are probably the ones that you're watching for the CFP, just because there's not that much room to go around. I think Alabama could win out and be a 10-2 team. I'm not even sure there would be room in that case, because then you might have 11-1 Texas, a 10-2 A&M with a win over LSU, a ton of different teams, and possibly a close loss over a team that's in the playoff already in Notre Dame. There's a lot of things that are going to be coming into play over the next couple of weeks, but I do feel like Georgia, Texas, Tennessee, and A&M are in the catbird seat right now. They have to win out. If they win out, they are in, all of those teams. So Texas would have to beat A&M and vice versa, or Georgia would have to beat Tennessee and vice versa. And those would be the teams that hypothetically have the chance to get to the SEC title and then possibly win it. But at the end of the day, it feels like it's about 7 teams, those 7 teams right there, competing for about 4 or 3 spots in the CFP. I don't know who gets them, but at the end of the day, with a lot of the other logjams we're about to look at, wouldn't be surprising to me if there were a couple of 10-2 teams in the SEC that were on the outside looking in. Then we move over to the Big Ten, and this one, probably the most digestible of all of the conferences. And it's not necessarily all that easy to break down, but it is one that you see the division. It's those 4 teams up top, and it's pretty much everyone else. Now, Illinois is a team that hypothetically could get to 10-2, possibly be in that fight. I think way too many things would have to happen for Illinois to get that done. So I'm not necessarily putting too much stock into Illinois down the stretch of the season. With losses to Penn State and Oregon, they're essentially out of the Big Ten title race, and I don't think they're going to get back into the CFP race. But you look at the other teams there. Indiana, rolling right along. There's a very good argument to be made that they're the second best team in this conference right now. I think Oregon, obviously the number 1 team in the country, very well could be the number 1 team in the conference. But at the end of the day, I think there's so many different things that can happen the rest of the way. Ohio State could beat 2 of the teams right on top of them, and Penn State and Indiana move up to the top, and then we get that rematch with Oregon. We could have Penn State win this upcoming weekend, kind of bury Ohio State, but then they might not even go if Indiana is able to beat Ohio State as well. So we could find a world where Ohio State's just entirely left out of this conversation in general, which would be absolutely crazy. I also think there's I don't want to say more likely, but definitely a scenario where you have 4 11-1 teams at the very top of this conference. Let's say Ohio State wins out, Indiana, Penn State only lose that game and none others, and Oregon loses a game along the way. That's going to be 3 11-1 teams as you head into that conference championship. I think it would be Ohio State, Oregon. I feel pretty good about that. But at the end of the day, it would still be all over the place in terms of who gets into the CFP. You probably have to let all 4 in, which would then probably take a little bit away from a team like Alabama, who's 10-2, or a team like Texas, possibly, who's 10-2 at the end of the year. It would be absolute chaos. But if you get those 4 top teams being 11-1 at the end of the year, that's probably the biggest chaos scenario. And that seems to be where we're heading in some respects. You still have those 3 teams up top that everyone has above everyone else, and I sort of agree. Indiana's closing that gap more and more as we get deeper and deeper throughout the season, but Indiana's right there and then a steep drop-off. There's no way that anyone else is going to be able to make a run at this conference, and probably not at the CFP, frankly. I can't imagine Wisconsin, Minnesota, or Iowa finding their way into the CFP this year. It's those 4 teams up top, and we'll see if any of them drop out or if it's just those 4 that find their way into the CFP. Over to the Big 12. This one, we finally got some answers in the Big 12 because I feel like we can cut this down to those top 4 teams. I don't think we need to worry about TCU, Texas Tech, Cincinnati, and so on the rest of the way. Now, you should watch them. They're very fun teams throughout that conference. But at the end of the day, there are so many different things that could have gone wrong in this conference, that could have gone haywire, that could have created this to be kind of a 5-10-2 team just all over the place. It is thinning out just a little bit. You have BYU and Iowa State up there undefeated. They're taking care of business. They're my favorite teams in the conference. I've made that very clear. Kansas State is my pick, or not. That's confusing. He was my pick to win the conference at the beginning of the year. Then in my midseason redos, picked Iowa State to win it. So I still have Kansas State in the championship. Still think they're going to run the table, but they need a little bit of help. BYU's got to be able to win the rest of the way. They have to avoid pitfalls at Utah and Arizona State. Iowa State, same thing with Texas Tech, Cincinnati before that KSU game. So a lot of things moving in that direction for this thing to kind of be worked out. Now, Colorado could take over this entire thing. They have 1 loss in conference, 2 losses overall. If they could absolutely win out, find themselves in Arlington at the end of the day and possibly make the playoff. Now, they could win out and not find their way into Arlington. They don't necessarily play a lot of the teams above them, and a lot of the teams above them could just handle their business. And then you have a 10-2 Colorado team that missed out on the Big 12 title, and you have to figure out how to handle that. So that's a whole problem for the CFP committee to handle. But at the end of the day, I think it is a conference that has thinned out quite a bit. You do have those 4 teams up top. Those are the ones that you're going to be watching as you move forward into the CFP. You got BYU, Iowa State, Kansas State, and Colorado. Those are going to be the teams that possibly have a shot at the CFP. Anyone beyond that, their job now is just to throw wrenches into the work. And there are plenty of teams that can do that. We talked about that Texas Tech Iowa State game. Colorado, I believe, has Utah at some point. There's a number of different games that could get in the way of these 4 teams possibly taking a stranglehold. But as you can see, there's quite the gap. There's 4 teams, and then there's pretty much everyone else in this conference right about now. Now, the everyone else has a ton of ability and can beat pretty much anyone in the conference on any given day. So this thing could get a little bit haywire towards the end of the season, but as of right now, it's Iowa State, BYU setting the pace, everyone else right there, Kansas State, Colorado right there, and then everyone else kind of just hanging out in the pack, really. And then you got the ACC. This is another one that is a little bit funny. It's a little bit all over the place. You have Clemson up top, Miami, SMU, and Pitt. All those teams are undefeated in conference, and at some point you're going to have to figure out which way this goes, but Pitt is going to be a team to watch throughout the rest of the way because they got SMU this upcoming weekend, they have Clemson in a couple of weeks. They win both those games, this thing handles itself pretty quickly. Clemson has a loss in conference, so does SMU. They both have 2 losses on the season, and Pitt and Miami likely go to the ACC championship. Now, if SMU were to beat Pitt this upcoming weekend, I don't know what that would do in terms of if Pitt were to lose those 2 games, they're definitely out of it. A 10-2 Pitt is probably not getting into the playoff field, although they've had an incredible season, wouldn't necessarily have the resume to get into the CFP if they were to lose these 2 games coming up. But they could go 1-1. SMU could win out the rest of the way, be 11-1, and then you have a Clemson team that could possibly lose to Pitt, be a 10-2 team, but only have 1 loss in conference, one of the losses being to Georgia. There's a lot to figure out in this conference, and Miami is still a team that I'm very worried about from a week-to-week basis, just being able to handle their business, not have to worry about anything, not have to give their fans a heart attack, which we'll talk about in the next segment here. But overall, I think there's those 4 teams up top. And then there's the chaos team, which is Virginia Tech. If they were to win out, and I think a couple of things go their way more than anything else, because I think they play Clemson in a couple of weeks. I could be wrong. They do play Clemson in a couple of weeks, as I've written down here. And then as long as Pitt falls a couple of times, they could be in this thing. And that would be the craziest turn of events and would probably confirm the ACC as a 1-bid league if I had to imagine. But at the end of the day, there's going to be so many things going on the next couple of weeks where Pitt SMU, if Pitt wins, they move on. They're definitely the team. SMU's probably out of the hunt for the CFP going forward. I think if SMU wins, a lot of things get a little bit crazy, but Pitt would have to beat Clemson to stay alive in this conference. So I do think it's going to shake itself out. I tend to believe that SMU and Pitt at some point are going to stumble the rest of the way, but they haven't yet. So it's hard for me to say that with absolute confidence. Obviously, someone has to lose this upcoming weekend. If it's SMU, you can pretty much write them off in this conference race. Having a loss to someone above you this deep in the season, not necessarily where you want to be if you're SMU. So overall, I think you look at all 4 of these conferences and you try to break down which teams are actually in the hunt, which teams aren't. You could have 4 undefeated or 11-1 teams in the Big Ten. You could have 4 in the ACC. You could have 3 in the Big 12. And you could have a lot of SEC teams that are right around that area, whether it's 10-2 or 11-1. I think there's going to be a lot of teams that are 10-2, that are maybe even 11-1 in certain respects, maybe 11-2 after a loss in your conference championship, and you look up and you're not getting into the playoff. I know that sounds crazy, but the deeper and deeper these undefeated teams like BYU and Iowa State and Indiana and Pitt, I was blanking on the last one, and Pitt, the longer these teams go into the season being undefeated, the higher those chances become. So all of these games in the latter half of the season, Texas falls to Florida in a couple of weeks, they're probably out of it. And it's crazy to think because they could go on, beat A&M and be, probably third or fourth in the conference, it wouldn't necessarily matter if you have 11-1 teams up in the Big Ten, if you have a million things to figure out in the Big 12, and then you got the G5 to figure out, and then you got Notre Dame that could come into the mix. So it could be those, I believe 20 teams is what I counted earlier, competing for 10 spots in this thing, which would be absolutely insane and would be a crazy last month, and that's what we're going to get into. We're going to have to figure out how we navigate that, but at the end of the day, we'll take our break and we'll figure out all of that in a later date. But we'll take our break here, and when we come back, we got some winners and losers from this past weekend. One of the biggest winners is all of the A&M boosters, because that investment feels pretty good right about now, but I'll break it down right after this.